Well, most of that's true anyways. So, in Alberta, back when it was the Wild West, back when people rode horses everywhere, and back when they rode around in wagons, and they were just starting to build the railways. Back then, well, some of you might actually remember, a little bit back, closer to that. Anyways, Edmonton and Calgary were a lot smaller. They were still large centers compared to everything else, but they were western outposts, and they had dirt roads and wood sidewalks. And when you went to the store, you still had to tie up your horse in front of it. Well, not only the place was different, but the weather was different too. It was more extreme. I mean, we still have extreme weather now. It was minus 40 during the winter and plus 40 during the summer. It could snow, rain, sleet, hail all in one day, but it's nothing compared to what they had before. No. For example, one winter they had so much snow that a mailman, when he was trying to deliver letters to Calgary, missed the city completely. He was halfway to Cochrane before he even realized his mistake. So he turns around, he's coming back to Calgary, when he hears this sound behind him, this kind of a whoosh sound. So he turns and he takes a look and he sees this wall of wind. Well, he doesn't see the wind so much, but he sees the effect of the wind. And it's melting all the snow and creating this huge flood. So he takes off running, but it catches up to him and sploosh down into the water, and he has to swim all the way back to Calgary to deliver his soggy letters. And this was the Wild West, or at least the Alberta version of the Wild West. This was... There wasn't a lot of outlaws and gangs and shootouts and stuff like that, the things you see in movies. But we did have Johnny Chinook, and we had all the strange characters that kind of show up in all of his adventures, and all the weird things that happened to him. You see, when Johnny was a teenager, he went to work as a ranch hand near Morley, Alberta. Morley is west of Calgary, right on the outskirts of the mountains. And as a ranch hand, part of his job was to help with the horses and help with the cattle, and once a month take a wagon to Calgary to pick up supplies and groceries. So you'd go to Calgary and pile the wagon high with big barrels of goods and supplies and crates and things, and then he'd head back. And month after month he does this until November. And when it starts snowing, then he puts away the wagon, pulls out the sleigh, and he goes to Calgary, and it snows the whole time there, or the whole way there, and it snows the whole way back. And it snows for the days after, and it snows for the weeks after. Christmas comes and it's still snowing. New Year's Eve comes and goes and it's still snowing. The entire month of January comes and goes and it's still snowing. Well, it finally stops in February. And by this time they had so much snow that the folks in Morley, when they wanted to go to church, they had to tie their horses up to the cross on the top of the steeple and then crawl through a snow tunnel just to get inside the building. Now this didn't stop Johnny though. He just hooked up his horses to the sleigh and away he went. So he just about halfway to Calgary when he heard this kind of howling, roaring sound behind him, this kind of a whoosh. No, he doesn't even have to look behind him. He grew up on the prairies. He knows what a Chinook sounds like. So he just jumps up, he snaps the reins, and he yells at his horses, and away they go. But the Chinook's catching up to him. It's getting louder and louder. It's whoosh. So he turns, he takes a look, and he realizes this is no ordinary Chinook. No, it's melting all the snow, evaporating all the water, and drying up all the land. And it's catching up to him. So he snaps the reins a couple more times and tries to get it going. But before he knows what to do, all of a sudden his sleigh starts to tip backwards. And the runners on his sleigh are starting to drag around the ground. So he turns around behind him and he's kicking up this huge dust storm behind him. And he snaps up and he snaps the reins and he's yelling at his horses and calling all sorts of names. And they're running as fast as they possibly can. And he rides the crest of the Chinook all the way into Calgary. Well, the wind is blowing him in the face and frostbiting his face, and the Chinook is cooking his back. So when he gets there, he's not feeling very good because he's got frostbite on his face, sunburn on his neck. But he hops out and he takes a look at his sleigh, and the back half of his runners are smoking and they've been completely worn off. And he's not the only one who's caught by surprise by this Chinook. No, the people in the church, when they come out, they're surprised to find no snow whatsoever, and they're even more surprised to hear whinnying above them and look up and see their horses dangling from the top of the church with Christmas bells. Well, it's strange. Johnny ran into all sorts of extreme weather. And a lot of it happened to happen, well, he was in Morley for some reason, I don't know. But you see, the summer after the Chinook was an excellent summer. Great for crops. So when the fall came, the farmers, they found themselves really undermanned. And one farmer, he was friends with the rancher that Johnny worked for. So the rancher decided he would lend a bunch of ranch hands to help with the harvest. So Johnny and a few other guys went and they found themselves working in the field. So they're out there working long hours in the t-shirts, just trying to bring the harvest in. And they don't seem to be making much progress because it's such a good harvest. If it wasn't the best harvest they had so far, it was one of the best. Well, October comes and goes, and they're starting to worry about frost. Because when the frost comes, then the harvest is wrecked, right? So they're working longer and longer hours, but luckily it's still warm out, and they're still out there in their t-shirts. But they're working and working, and by the end of October, they finally bring in all the harvest. And it's still really no sign of winter whatsoever. November goes by, and there's absolutely no sign at all. December comes, and some of the farmers decide to experiment a little bit, and they plant some potatoes. Well, Christmas comes, and the kids are outside playing in their shorts and their summer dresses. New Year's Eve comes, and they have this big festival, like they would during the summer. A big fire and dance outside with music and celebration. And come January, there's absolutely no sign of winter whatsoever. The leaves are still in the trees. They haven't changed color at all. The grass is still fine. And because the cold never came, it never killed the mosquitoes off. So they grew and grew until they were about the size of small birds. And well, the potatoes were starting to come up as well. So the farmers decided, well, there's no sign of winter at all, so we might as well just put in the crops. So you think that would be normal, they just put in the crops, they do it every year. But it was a little bit harder this year because they had to do it with one hand, and one hand on a baseball bat or a stick trying to beat the mosquitoes off. And some of the richer farmers, they hired guys to follow them around with sticks and beat the mosquitoes off. Well, the winter months come and pass, and everything's growing up nice and big, including mosquitoes. And it's almost looking kind of like harvest time, but everybody decides to leave their crops in. And the animals are starting to have their babies, and so they have little lambs and calves and things rolling around, and the mosquitoes would come down and they'd swoop in and pick them up and take them away. So people like Johnny and the ranch hands, they had to sleep outside with the animals with their baseball bats, and when they heard the mosquitoes coming, which were so big by now, it was really easy to hear them, they would get up and they'd swat at them. Well, they did this until the animals were big enough that the mosquitoes couldn't carry them away. But by that time, the mosquitoes were so big they could barely carry themselves. And fall comes, and I can't even describe this harvest. It's just incredible. I mean, the wheat fields, they look like forests. In fact, they had to bring in lumberjacks to help chop down the wheat fields. I'm not kidding. The potatoes, they had to dig these huge trenches and things, and then they get the horses up and they put slings around the potatoes and they pull them out. There was even rumors that this one guy had hollowed out a potato and made a house out of it. Well, the carrots were so big that they had to build cranes to pull them out of the ground. And once there was this rabbit watching them pull a carrot out of the ground, and you can imagine how excited he was, right? And the more excited he got, the higher he jumped. So they're pulling it up, and he's bouncing and pulling it more, and he's bouncing and pouring it up, he's jumping and jumping, and they pull it all the way up, and he shoots up in the air, and nobody ever sees him come back down. And this isn't even talking about the onions and the cabbages and the lettuce. They have tons and tons of food, which is great because come the next November, it started snowing and it didn't stop for 2 months or for 2 years. But that's a completely different story. I want to get on with stories that don't involve weather all the time. So one of the peculiarities of Johnny was he always wore these bright red socks. And if you asked him where he got these socks, he'd tell you that his grandma gave them to him for his birthday. And when she gave them to him, she said, "Johnny, these are the last pair of socks you're ever going to need." So he just threw all the rest of his socks out and wore these every day since. And the really odd thing about these socks isn't that they're bright red, or that he wears them every day, or their terrible smell. No, the odd thing about these socks is that fish love them. You see, when Johnny goes fishing, he doesn't use a rod and a hook. No, he takes off his boot, sticks his foot in the water, and wiggles his toes. Before long, the fish will come up, grab onto his toe, you just give it a kick, fly over his head, land in a nice neat pile behind him, and you just keep doing that until you decide you had enough, put his boot back on, grab the pile of fish, and away you go. And just to give you an idea how much the fish love these socks, one winter Johnny was taking a walk, and he had his boots on, and he'd pulled his socks up over top of his pants. You know, sometimes you do that so you don't get your pants wet. And you could just see the socks, just barely above the boot. And he was walking across the Bow River when he hears this knocking sound. He looks around, but he can't see anything. So he keeps going, and he hears this knocking down below, and he realizes it's below him. And he takes a look, and there's this fish knocking its head against the bottom of the ice. So he figures it needs to get out, and he takes his rifle butt and smashes a hole in the ice, and out it jumps right into the freezing cold air, and freezes solid, lands hard on the ice. But not just one fish, but 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 bull trout, all fall frozen in a nice neat pot. So he just scoops them up, puts them in his pack, and he's got food for the next week. Now, it's important to remember another thing that Johnny wears is he always has his lasso around his waist like a belt. And that's important for the next story. So, Johnny had given up being a ranch hand after a few years, and he decided to go and move around, do lots of different things. And he did. And one of those things was he became an ox cart driver. And, well, I expected some children, so I assume all you know what an ox cart is, so I'll skip that part. But he absolutely loved it. And he traveled all over the prairies. In fact, the prairies were crisscrossed with his runs. And this one particular time, he was traveling from, Medicine Hat, up to deliver some goods, big barrels of salt and things, all the way up to Fort Macleod. And on his way, he was passing by a lake, and he decided that it was time for lunch, so he stops over and lets his oxen loose to go and graze and things, and he goes down to the lake and figures he'll catch himself some lunch. So he takes off his boot, and he puts his foot in the water, and he wiggles his toes, like you do. And before long, the water starts to bubble and boil, and then heaves out, and this fish jumps out and latches onto his leg. Well, his eyes go from here to here, and he's kicking and trying to get the fish off, and making this big splashy mess. So he doesn't see that the water's starting to bubble and boil again, and heave up. And this other bigger fish comes, swallows that fish, bites his foot off, and takes off into the lake. So Johnny's standing there on one foot, but only for a second. Because then he jumps in after the fish and starts swimming towards him. And it's important to remember that Johnny is a world-class swimmer. You see, he swam the whole length of both the North and South Saskatchewan rivers, no kidding. So he's catching up to this fish, right? And he gets close enough that he pulls out his lasso and ropes the fish. But he's used to roping horses, so he gives it a tug, but he realizes then, a little too late, that he doesn't have, he's in the water, he has nothing to pull on. So the fish takes off and he just falls along. Well, he's not ready to give up yet, so he pulls himself hand over hand until he's close enough fish to hop on and ride him. And of course, as an old ranch hand by now, he's an excellent rider. So he rides this fish all over the lake, above and below. And he rides it so long that the fish becomes so exhausted that it just falls over and dies. Well, Johnny pulls the fish up onto the shore, cuts her open and sticks his head in. And he's scooting around until he finds his foot, and he comes out and he pops his foot back on. And he goes back in and he pulls out the fish that originally swallowed his foot. And then he goes back in and he finds not only that fish, but 5 other fish about the same size or bigger. Just to give you an idea how big this fish was, even though nobody he tells this story to afterwards will believe him. Well, Johnny cuts up a little bit of fish and has himself his lunch. And then he cuts up all the rest of the fish, dumps out the salt barrels, fills those with fish, still has too much, starts filling up the crates and things, anywhere he has a little spare piece, stuffs it into his tent, stuffs it into his bags. He still has fish, so he stuffs them in his pockets, in his jacket pockets, his chest pockets, sticks them in his hat until he's got fish everywhere. Well, he goes up to Fort Macleod, and he's able to sell some of this fish. He's so much fish, he's eating it every day for the next month after month after month, and he gets so sick of it that he can't even look at water for the next couple of years.